Hello everyone, let's take a look at these different types of mixed methods designs. There are essentially two types of designs. There are convergent designs where we can collect both strands of data at the same time. There are also sequential designs where one strand is dependent upon another one. Now you'll see on this slide it talks about both convergent and embedded. Since this textbook that this was based on, this was a couple years ago in our course, is where these designs come from. Since then, the field has kind of dropped embedded as its own design. However, it does give an example of what a convergent design could look like. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it in there. But in the future, if you don't see embedded in there, that's just kind of a sign of how the field is evolving. And they're leaning more towards convergent with embedded as a type of convergent. But anyway, you didn't want to know all that. Let's talk about these convergent designs. So in convergent, what it means is that we can collect both sets of data at the same time. Now that does not mean that they have to be collected simultaneously. What it essentially means, and what a better definition would be, is that I don't have to wait on the results of this one to be able to design and distribute my instrument for this one. I can do either one first. I can do them at the same time. I can do them separate. I could do this one first, or I can do this one first, that we're not dependent on one to be able to do the other. And then you'll see afterwards we bring them both together in this interpretation stage. So an example of this is a study. I don't remember the researcher's name, but she was looking at rape culture and issues of consent on a college campus. And she used a scale that was her way of operationalizing that idea of culture of consent, the climate on a particular college campus. And so she had this scale. Think back to when we were talking about operationalization. How do we measure abstract things? For example, the culture of consent on a college campus. We have to choose a tool. With that, we know that those tools are not necessarily always 100% perfect. And so part of what she was looking at was she collected the quantitative data. So she sent out this scale, this survey. And what she found was that this college campus had for the most part, a very positive culture of consent. There was a very positive attitude on this campus regarding consent and avoidance of sexual violence. And so everything looked great. What she followed it up with was the qualitative piece. I'm not sure if she collected them at the exact same time or if one came a little bit before the other. One was not dependent on the other, and that's what makes it convergent. The qualitative piece, she did some focus groups and some interviews with people. And what she found in these focus groups is the types of things that they were talking about were not necessarily very positive. It did not align with this very positive culture that came out of the quantitative design. And what she found in the qualitative piece were that there were some major issues on that college campus that made it not so positive in terms of a culture of consent that were missed by this instrument, or they were misinterpreted by this instrument. And so by comparing the results of the two, she was able to get a more accurate description of what was actually going on that campus, and in a way to kind of test the validity of this particular instrument. Another example of this would be, this is actually an example that we're going to talk about in the evaluation module that comes up next. Because it was an evaluation, but as you'll see in evaluation, we use the same methods as we do in these others. What we were looking for was there was a program, and we were looking to see if students' literacy scores went up over the course of a year. We wanted to know if they went up statistically significantly, meaning more than just maturation, because the kids would be a year older, they would have gone through a year of school. It's understood that their literacy scores would go up some just from going to school. So we wanted them to go up a set significant amount so we can say that it wasn't just going to school, that it was also this literacy program. And this program was hosted in the housing developments in New Orleans. And what we found in the quantitative piece, so this is where we took the literacy scores There was some type of literacy test that they used, and it got the scores. And they found that there really wasn't a significant difference over the course of a year. Nothing to where they could say it was due to their program and not due to just spending a year in school. But we also, so according to this, it was a failure. But what we also did were some qualitative focus groups and interviews. And what we found in those focus groups and interviews were that the parents found it to be a great success. For them, it meant that their children were less likely to get into trouble after school because they had somewhere to go. The parents were less worried about their children after school while they were still at work. The children were more likely to turn in their homework, is what the teacher said. They tended to behave better in class than the other students. Overall, there were some very positive impacts of participating in this program for this group of students that were missed by this quantitative measure. So by having both of those, we were able to get the full picture of what that particular program was doing. Now, embedded designs are a type of convergent design, and really all that an embedded design is where the qualitative piece and the quantitative piece are essentially in the same instrument. So if you've ever completed a survey where they had a lot of quantitative questions, but then at the end they had kind of a little text box where they asked you to kind of write in your response. So maybe you did a lot of multiple choice type things, and then at the end they gave you something, a text box where you could just write in your opinion, for example. It's usually towards the end of a survey because they know if you put that at the beginning of the survey, nobody is going to finish the survey because they're going to think it's all writing. So an embedded design is where one of them, they're just in the same instrument is all it really means. So it's an option for convergent at this point in the field is how people are discussing it. So for both of these, the main thing to remember is that these could be collected at any time or at the same time. The important part is that one is not dependent on the other. And what do I mean by that dependent piece? Right? So the dependent ones fall into these sequential designs. Both of these are sequential. Let me go ahead and type this up there because I can see how that's confusing. So these are sequential designs, both of these. We have two types of sequential designs. We have explanatory sequential and we have exploratory sequential. The difference between these two is how the qualitative strand is used, right? So let's look at the first one. In both of these, however, we will not be able to even start collecting this data until this particular piece is done. So it's impossible to collect them at the same time. It's impossible to do this one first instead of that one. We have to do them in this particular order, and we can't even start the second one until this one is done. That's what makes it a sequential design. Now, why would we have to wait on one before we start the other? Essentially, we're using the results of these first strands here to develop the instruments perhaps that we use here, maybe to select who our participants are that we use here. So in an explanatory model, we're using the qualitative strand to help explain the findings of the quantitative strand. So for example, perhaps I send out a survey, and in that survey, I find some interesting trends in the data. But remember, that survey is just giving me that surface level data, right? It's not giving me a lot of depth. It's telling me what people are doing, but it's not telling me how or why they're doing it, right? So the qualitative at that point, the train is in the background, so I apologize if that's coming across on the microphone. The quantitative strand gives us that wide breadth of content, but the qualitative is going to help us figure out the who, what, why, instead of just taking a snapshot of what people are doing. So this gives us more detail, adds more detail to this quantitative piece. Perhaps I only want to interview, let's say I'm looking at, maybe I also want to use this to help find out who I'm going to sample. I take people who scored really, really high on this survey, and I take people who scored really, really low on this survey. And then I do focus groups with both of them to see, what made them select something on the high end versus the low end. So I can use this for sampling, and I can use this for deciding which topics I want to talk about. Now, exploratory is also sequential. Both of these are sequential, right? Explanatory sequential, exploratory sequential. People always miss that on the exam. Both of these are sequential. In this one, the qualitative is helping me explore what's out there so I can build my quantitative strand, right? So if you remember the qualitative, how qualitative is used, if qualitative is being used to explain the other one, then it's explanatory. If qualitative is being used to explore so we can develop the other, then it's exploratory, right? So what do I mean by exploratory? What do I mean by exploring? So let's say I want to develop a survey to send out to people about their feelings about some type of educational mandate from the state, or I want to know their feelings about HIV stigma, for example, is one that a student has done in the past. I want to know how they feel about those particular things. So I want to send out a survey to see how the broader society, the community, feels about these things. And I want it to be generalizable. I want to send it to a large group of people so I can confidently say this is how people in Birmingham feel about these topics, right? But I don't have a survey that's currently developed to discuss those things. I don't know what kind of options to even begin putting into that survey. I don't know how people are talking about these things to even begin to develop items for them to be able to select on a survey, for example. So, what I would do is I would do a qualitative strand first, where I interview people. I talk to them about these topics. Maybe I do focus groups. I do something where I'm collecting all of that data and coming up with a qualitative analysis of those themes and of those patterns. And then I can use that content to develop a quantitative instrument, be a survey or some type of scale, whatever it is that I'm trying to develop. And then I can generalize to a bigger population some of those themes that I found in qualitative, right? So sequential is going to be one has to come before the other. So I couldn't develop this survey without doing the qualitative first because I needed those results to make my survey. I couldn't do these interviews here in this first one. I couldn't do these interviews first because I wouldn't know what I was going to ask. I had to finish the quantitative data first to see what was kind of some interesting trends in the data. So then I knew who I needed to go talk to and what I needed to ask them about. Both of these are sequential. Remember, we're using the term that discusses how the qualitative strand is used. Qualitative is explaining the quan, explanatory. Qualitative is exploring to build the quan, exploratory, right? If we can reverse it, go back and forth, or collect them at the same time, theoretically, it would be a convergent design. If we're embedding one type of data collection within the other instrument, it's an embedded design, which is just another version of a convergent design, right? I know that's kind of a mouthful. We teach an entire course on these types of designs, EPR 792, for those of you who are interested in the future. But it's a little hard to condense a whole semester's worth of content into one module. So in the next video, I will walk you through an example of a study that we did using a mixed methods design so you can kind of see how those parts come together. You'll also have an activity in this week's module. So if you have any questions about this, let me know, and I will see you online or in my email.